trends that have been well documented in the literature and that form a backdrop to the discussion about what issue strategies that interest groups take in their electoral efforts. And the first trend is something we know pretty well, and that comes out of the talk from, we just saw this previous, that interest group efforts in elections are on the rise. And so this is a graph that uses Wisconsin Advertising Project and Wesleyan Media Project data. I'm fortunate enough to be part of this project, which tracks campaign TV ads in the top markets across the country on broadcast television stations. And this allows us to look over time to see the efforts of interest groups in elections over a decade and a half, and to see the change in the nature of those efforts. So we know, certainly post-Citizens United, but for lots of other reasons before Citizens United, that interest groups are interested in elections and that they've increased their efforts in elections. Such that in 2014, 1 in every 5 ads aired in gubernatorial races in the election year were sponsored by outside groups, and 1 in every 3 ads aired in Senate elections were sponsored by outside groups. And when you add party committees, traditional party organizations to the mix, nearly 40% of gubernatorial ads were outside sponsored, non-candidate ads, and nearly 50% in the Senate contest. And this is way up from the efforts of groups in Senate elections and gubernatorial races in the early 2000s. This masks a little bit of diversity because interest groups were quite aggressive in the House context in 2000 and in presidential elections also, but we're seeing this trend across campaigns, and we'll see probably even bigger numbers in this most recent current election cycle. And so we know this first fact, that interest group ads are on the rise, that presence of elections is growing. What we also know from previous analysis of the advertising data is that interest group advertisements are incredibly negative. And so if you look at an interest group's effort in a Senate race or in a gubernatorial race, and you count up in that race the number of ads that they aired, or the percentage of ads that they aired that attack an opposing candidate as opposed to promote a candidate, and you look at all of those efforts in various media markets and in different races by all these groups, and you sort of graph the distribution of those efforts, it looks like this, such that the distribution is heavily weighted towards groups who do most of their efforts being on the attack side of the equation. Very few interest groups spend a lot of money promoting candidates, but instead do a lot attacking candidates. And so we know that interest group ads are on the rise, and we know that their efforts are largely negative. But what we don't know as much about is the content of these ads beyond tone and their effect on the agenda of campaigns, how the issues they raise intersect with the issues that the candidates they're promoting also advertise on. And so to begin answering this question, my colleagues and I leverage a concept called issue convergence, which attempts to, across all possible issues in a campaign ad, measure the amount of issue overlap. And it's something used in the literature. It's not a deep thought kind of concept, but what it basically does is look at the percentage of ads aired by various sponsors. So in this particular case, say, a candidate sponsor or an interest group sponsor. And imagine a situation where there are 5 possible ads in which they could advertise. Now, in our coding scheme, we we code ads on contents over 5 dozen different types of issues on everything you can imagine. And so, in truth, this estimation strategy goes out to sort of 60 columns and looks at all the ads aired across all the possible issues on our coding sheet. But in this case, across these 5 issues, you have a candidate spending a certain amount of attention on issues 2, 3, 4, and 5, and an interest group spending attention on issues 1, 3, and 4. And it measures the difference between that proportionate attention on the different types of sponsors to get a sense of how much proportionate issue overlap there is between them. So on issue 1, an interest group spends 60% of its ad buys in a race on, or interest group on issue 1, and candidates spend no time on that. So that will pull down a measure of issue convergence. Whereas they spend similar or roughly proportionate amounts of attention on issues 3 and 4, which will help boost up measures of issue convergence. So the measurement is very flexible in the sense that you can put any 2 sponsors on the rows here and just simply aggregate up to the level that you're interested in. And in this case, it would be the level of the race and media market efforts in that race, the amount of attention that these different sponsors pay, and then calculate issue convergence this way. It's very flexible in that sense. There are some weaknesses and challenges in this, of course, but but this gives us a good amount of issue overlap, or a sense of issue overlap between these various sponsors. Now, what we do in this paper is we estimate issue convergence between interest groups in Senate and gubernatorial races in 2014 and with the candidates that they are promoting. And we look at ads aired in the fall of the campaign season. And if you look at the distribution of interest group or issue convergence in that way in 2014, you see a distribution that looks like this. For Democratic and Republican candidates, the modal convergence score in a race in an immediate market for a group and a candidate is 0. But there's a fair amount of variance in that measurement. But if you look at this graph in comparison with the previous one on negativity, we learn something right off the bat, which is that interest group efforts in contemporary American elections are very negative, and they're not very convergent with the candidates they're promoting. In that sense, attacks from interest groups in elections are on issues that candidates that they're promoting don't emphasize or aren't emphasizing all that much. Now, that does devalue the diversity that exists in this measurement, and also any diversity or variance that might exist across different types of advertisers and different types of groups. So one way to look at this is to break out issue convergence scores by different types of sponsors, different types of pairings, and specific interest groups. So we do that in this sense in 2014. And there's a couple things to consider with this set of data. The first is that candidate convergence, that is to say the issue overlap between Democrats and Republican candidates in the races we cover in 2014, is amongst the highest levels of convergence in any of the pairings that we have in this table. That is, candidates converge on the same set of issues at a rate of about 0.3, whereas at the bottom of the table, groups and the candidates they're promoting converge at significantly lower rates. Now, what is high convergence and what is low convergence? A measurement of 1 would be perfect issue convergence between two sponsors, but that's probably a high standard on which to expect different sponsors in their advertisements. We measure across 60 columns, different issue overlap is at the proportionate issue overlap, and candidates just have different issue priorities, as do many other advertising sponsors. So the baseline might be with the candidate convergence scores, or perhaps the candidate and their party committees, which are right underneath the candidate convergence estimates there, which are also fairly high in comparison to the mean estimates for groups and for candidates at the bottom. But for many of the groups advertising in the elections of 2014, many of the top groups advertised or converged with the candidates that they were promoting at rates that matched or exceeded either candidate convergence or the party candidate convergence. And many of the groups that did so are groups that are super PACs or other organizations that have been very concerning to many campaign finance reformers in recent years, like Senate Majority PAC, Crossroads GPS, Freedom Partners, which is not very high, this one, American Crossroads, or the Ending Spending Action Fund, have convergence rates that are not tiny in comparison to where the candidates are or where the party committees are with their candidates, if we see that as a sort of baseline comparison. A group level focus is interesting, and it's important for us to think about whether or not new or old types of groups or different types of groups of various forms produce higher or lower rates of issue convergence. And in fact, if you look at the bottom of the list of interest groups there, many of the single issue groups are the ones that have incredibly low rates of convergence. Next Gen Climate Change, the NRA, Mayday PAC, the NEA. Traditional single issue interest groups tend to converge at very low rates, whereas perhaps the bigger, in some places might say more concerning, super PACs have convergence rates that are a little higher. So that might affect how we interpret what these groups are doing in elections. But a different way to look at it is to ask the question of, well, how many issues are these interest groups, new issues, are these interest groups introducing into our electoral environment so that to that extent voters are then seeing perhaps a whole range of new issues. And maybe that's what we're actually concerned about, not comparative rates of issue convergence, but how many new issues are being introduced by all these new players. And that compels us to look at sort of the race level as opposed to the group level. And so if you estimate, in this case, the number of new issues introduced by groups in a race, the unit of analysis here is each group in a Senate or gubernatorial race in which they're interested. How many new issues are introduced? So groups that advertised in 2014 introduced no new issues into the electoral environment, whereas 57% did, and 26% of those groups introduced at least 2 new issues. And so the more advertisers there are in an election, the more new issues you're likely to see on the agenda. A different way to look at that, slightly differently, is to look at specific elections and to try to get a sense of what issue convergence can introduce. So in this case, we looked at 4, just sort of case studies, 4 races from 2014, 2 of the most competitive Senate races and 2 of the most competitive gubernatorial races. And what we did here was on the y-axis are all the issues on our coding sheet. So each sort of row here up the y-axis is an issue. And they're ranked from the lowest commitment from the Democratic candidate to the highest commitment from the Democratic candidate, such that you'll see the blue dots sort of curve down, so that the issues at the top are the ones that the Democratic candidate cared or spent the most on. And then we add to each of those rows the Republican candidate efforts and then Democratic and Republican group and party ads to the mix. And the results in a graph like this tell a pretty messy story about the role of issue convergence or divergence in elections. Consider, for example, the Iowa Senate race. On a number of issues, the candidates devoted proportionately different attentions. In fact, the Democratic candidates' top issue mentions are very different from the Republican candidates' very top issue mentions. But still, for the cluster of issues at the top of the plot, both Democratic and Republican candidates were on the air on those issues. The real story is, in this case, is the additional plots up and down the vertical list of issues, with ads from groups or party committees on issues that get very little or no attention from one or both of the candidates. In other words, take out the gray plotted points, and you are likely to see a very starkly different issue agenda on the air than when you add in the efforts of additional supportive actors. This is the kind of thing that one might see as a complication arising from additional advertisers in campaigns. So there's much to consider in results such as this. One, of course, is a call for more research. One we don't know anything about is the impact that this issue divergence or various rates of issue convergence have on voters and voter decision-making. I'll say that more on that in a second. Or about how persuasive ad buys are in an election. There's also a question about variance and measuring variance, modeling variance across group types. One way to get at that, perhaps, is to consider the very different types of groups involved in our elections today. The Center for Responsive Politics produces this nice graph for us, which measures the amount of outside spending reported to the Federal Election Commission by outside groups back to 1990, capturing things like independent expenditures, electioneering communications, communication costs. And the change over time is very similar to the change I started with, in that there are more outside spending efforts today than there were 20, 10, 15 years ago. But we also know that many of these groups either do not report their spending to the FEC or do not report their donors to the FEC, as we've heard about. And I've been working with the folks at the Center for Responsive Politics to try to categorize groups that are advertising in races as far back as we can go into classifications of disclosing group or non-disclosing group. And all that work's sort of ongoing. One of the things we see here is that in congressional races in 2000-2002, the percentage of group ads from non-disclosing sources was fairly significantly high. In House races, it was 40%. Senate races, it was 70%. And the last 2 recent cycles, we see similar rates. 50% of the ads here are from groups that do not disclose their sources. And so it's possible that non-disclosing groups and disclosing groups have various rates of issue convergence that we might be concerned about. It's an area for future research. But in terms of making sense of these results, exploratory as they are at this point, I think one can infer both good news and bad news for the impacts on our efforts at campaign finance reform. The first is a little bit of good news. Most top groups from that graph where we talked about the first 15 or the top 15 group efforts in elections look like parties in the sense that their mean levels of issue convergence with the candidates they're supporting match or exceed the traditional party committee efforts on behalf of their candidates. In fact, the groups least likely to talk about the same issues as the candidates they support are those single issue groups. So in that sense, Citizens United has not encouraged, per se, the types of groups that have as their primary goal shifting the issue agendas of competitive elections. imagine that low issue convergence, such that it is not a bad thing and may actually be normatively and empirically a good thing. Matz and Redlosk have a book from 2014 called The Positive Case for Negative Campaigning, where they consider a range of different types of voter decision-making. And they conclude that voters are not generally sophisticated consumers of political information, such that the absence of issue mentions in a campaign does not convey much value to voters, much value to voters. But it doesn't have to be that way. It could be that the lack of issue mentions sends some important signals to voters. If support for gun control in the state is high, for example, and a candidate fails to emphasize his or her support for such a policy, one might surmise that the candidate opposes gun control. Thus, what is explicitly on the agenda is conceivably as important and informational to voters as what's not. But their book makes clear that this is not how voters approach decision-making, that they tend to use the information that's directly put in front of them to weigh their voting decisions. And as such, there's some electoral benefit for candidates to avoid advertising on topics that might expose them as holding positions counter to their constituents. Therein lies, for them, the value of negative elections. We might say the same thing here about the additional ad sponsors in a campaign, their additional issue mentions, and especially and specifically on issues or on topics that the candidates have made the explicit judgment to avoid for whatever reason. But there's no sidestepping the potential and bigger concern, perhaps, that many groups enter the debate in a close election, and when they do so, the race can become about a whole different set of issues. It might be quantitatively harder for voters to know what an election hinges on, and perhaps more importantly, it might make it harder for the winning candidate to know what to advocate for when they're elected to office. Issue convergence between competing candidates is quite high, and so the issue narrative of the campaign is a whole lot messier as groups become more involved in the election. We know from previous political science work that candidates try to implement policies on the types of issues that they advertise about in an election. And presumably they do so in part because they consider the win as an endorsement of their policies. Such a mandate for policymaking, such that it is not so clear with more and varied outside players. So all told, this type of work on the issue agendas present in campaigns is exploratory on the question to the extent which different ad sponsors talk about and inject new issues into elections. We know from some recent work in 2014 that it was one without really a dominant theme, particularly in senatorial campaigns that year. And indeed, our rates of issue convergence that we estimated in 2014 look lower than the ones that my collaborators and I have estimated in previous election cycles. So is this part of a growing trend? What will 2016 bring? And what is the ultimate takeaway on the health of all of this for our electoral process? The answer probably depends on one's perspective on the larger matter, the good news, bad news I lay out, but it does also critically depend on our future research and the work of some careful attention needs to be paid to how all of this affects the influence of ads and the issue agendas that voters themselves care about. So I'll end there. I look forward to the comments and the conversation.
Our next speaker is Chara Torres-Felici, and she's from Stetson University. She's extensively published in a wide variety of law journals that are too extensive to mention. And as a political scientist, I'm particularly impressed that she publishes things that people read as well. She's published extensively in places like the New York Times, CNN, and Forbes, and a lot of cool political junkie magazine kind of sites as well. And she's a Brennan Center Fellow. And I had something else in my list that I'm totally forgetting. She's pretty awesome. Yeah. And I'm really looking forward to her talk, and I very much enjoyed reading her paper. She'll be telling us today about shooting your brand in the foot, what Citizens United invite.
Hey, you give good introduction.
I'll take being awesome. So while Rick was talking this morning, I finally got proofs from my publisher of my forthcoming book. Yay! So it means it's actually happening. So that book is called Corporate Citizen, with a question mark at the end of that. And it touches on some of the things that this paper touches on as well, which is the political valence of brands. So, let me start with this. This is a picture of my father. He was a asking today is, will corporate political spending hurt corporate brands? So we have to think about, are brands political at all? Senator Russ Feingold, in 2012, he's talking at Netroots Nation, and he made this prediction that the way we were going, we're going to have Democratic and Republican toothpaste. And what he predicted with that is that certain brands would be associated with one political party, and consumers from the opposing political party would boycott those products. And just to be clear, he was not predicting this as a good thing. He said this is dangerous, the way things are going. So let's think about whether brands are political at all. One of the ways you could think about it is through geography. And geography may not be the first thing you think about when you think about brands, but brands are located in certain localities. They are, you have a store here but not there. Similarly, we elect our members of Congress from bounded political locations. And so Time Magazine did this very interesting mashup in 2014, and the reason that there's more red than blue is there are more Republican representatives that were elected in 2014. And so here's some of the top line of what Time Magazine found when they did this matchup. So if you lived in a district with an LLB, a Ben & Jerry's, or a Trader Joe's, you were more likely to be represented by a Democrat in Congress. And by contrast, if you lived in a district with a Cracker Barrel, Hobby Lobby, or Waffle House, then your district was most likely represented by a Republican in Congress. So when I showed this to Michael Kang, he said, "This is too superficial." And good point, Professor Kang. If this is too superficial for you, we can get inside your brain. So there is this really creepy outfit called biology, and I find them creepy. Maybe if you're in branding, you find them genius. But what they do is they hook people up to MRIs, and they look at what part of your brain lights up when you see a particular piece of branding. And using this technology of seeing what part of your brain lights up when you see a logo for Apple, for example, they have found that there is a difference in self-identified partisan consumers. That Democrats desired, maybe it's all in a name, they desired progressive when they are buying insurance, while by contrast, Republicans are attracted to Allstate. And they find these differences across many product categories. So we're drinking different coffees, we're playing on different gaming systems. Partisans also seem to be attracted to different cars. Democrats like the very boring Honda Civic, while the Republicans like the much cooler Ford Mustang. Partisans also drink different alcohol. The Democrats apparently like their Heine's, while the Republicans like their Sammys. Now there are truly bipartisan brews. Bud Light apparently is enjoyed on both sides of the political aisle, but the people who studied this actually spend a lot of time on it, and they find that the Bud Light drinkers do not get out to vote. They never make it all the way to the polls. So while they are very bipartisan and they will talk to one another more than others, they actually get out the vote. It's horrible with them. So another way you could think about the partisanship of brands is the money in politics lens. And so a group called Good Guy back in 2009 looked at it this way. They no longer do this, to my chagrin. But when they did this analysis, they found that if you looked at the money that was coming from corporate PACs and from executives in these corporations, that the most Republican brand was actually Bissell. And by contrast, on the Democratic side, that the most Democratic brand was Aveda. So pre-Citizens United, we already know that corporations were spending in politics. They were spending in the half of the states that already allowed corporate political spending. And I looked at this a couple of years ago in a piece called The $500 Million question. And what I was looking at was the money that was flowing through the Republican Governors Association and the Democratic Governors Association. And what I found when I did that, so here's all of the money that was flowing through both groups over the 8 years that I studied. And the sort of quick takeaway from all of these numbers is that the RGA has more money running through it in most years. They both raise more money and spend more money than their Democratic counterpart. But I was really interested in the corporate money that was going through both groups. And if you looked at the money over both of the groups over all 8 years, roughly half of the money flowing through these groups is from a corporate source. And what was surprising to me is that most of the corporate money was from publicly traded companies. So after Citizens United, there was a lot of discussion about, well, a publicly traded company will never get involved in politics. And to that I say bullshit. And I have the data to back this up. Publicly traded companies were more involved in funding at the state level than their private counterparts. And if you break down the publicly traded money, it is not equally divided between the two groups. Most of the money was going to the Republican Governors Association versus the Democratic Governors Association by a ratio of nearly 2 to 1. You could also look at it on a firm-by-firm basis instead of a dollar-by-dollar basis. And I think sort of interestingly in this particular data set, most of the corporations, the publicly traded corporations that were giving at this time to the RGA and DGA were giving to both at the very same time. You might think of that as hedging your bets. But there were a certain cohort among the publicly traded corporations that were loyal, if you will. They would only give to the RGA, or they would only give to the DGA. But there, the ratio is more stark. It's nearly 4 to 1, that there were four times as many firms that would only give to the Republican side as opposed to the Democratic side. And in the past couple of cycles, publicly traded firms have also funded at the federal level, but it's gone almost entirely to conservatives, either Republicans or self-identified Tea Party candidates. And we know this because there are great resources out there that are tracking money in politics. There's followthemoney.org and opensecrets.org. And when you pull the stats from those sources, you get things like this. So in the last presidential election, the big publicly traded corporation that spent in that election was Chevron. And so they spent $2.5 million. Chevron was also back in the midterm. They spent $1 million, but they were no longer the biggest spender. The biggest spender was actually Alliance Resource Partnerships, LP, which is a publicly traded LP. Now, those two slides probably underrepresent the amount of corporate money that was spent in the last few federal elections. And the reason I say that is we have this huge dark money problem. At least $600 million in dark money, as in money where you can't trace the source, has been spent. And about a tenth of that flows through the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is a business trade association. And so I think it's reasonable to assume that the money that's going through the chamber is actually from a corporate source, but we will never know because it is dark. And because of this dark money problem, there has been this effort at the Securities and Exchange Commission to try to get the SEC to promulgate a rule that would apply to publicly traded companies so that they would have to tell their investors where they are spending in politics. And the happy part of this story is that over 1 million people took time out of their days to comment on this petition to urge the SEC to act. The sad part of the story is they haven't done anything. So I would say a good disclosure law is worth its weight in gold. In order for voters and investors to be able to react to these things, and for consumers to be able to react to these things, you need transparency. And Citizens United, I think, if it did anything at all, it did heighten the public scrutiny of corporate political activity. As I said, there was a lot of corporate political activity pre-Citizens United, and you can see that in the DGA and RGA. But I think Citizens United put a focus on this type of activity. And one of the ways you can see that is what happened to Target in 2010. So Target gave money to a group called Minnesota Forward, and then Minnesota Forward spent that money in support of a candidate named Tom Emmer, who was running for governor in Minnesota. And lots of people were upset about this. And I think they were upset about this for a number of reasons. For some, they didn't like that a corporation was spending in politics. For others, they didn't like that a corporation was spending in support of a Republican candidate. And thirdly, I think they did not like Tom Emmer's stance on gay marriage. He was anti-gay marriage. And this was a problem for Target because Target had a reputation of being good for gay rights. They were very proud of how they were inclusive in hiring gay employees. And so for some, it was the hypocrisy of it all. And so as a result of this political spending, Target gets boycotted. And you can still see some of the artwork from the Target boycott online. And so you see things like this. And the last one, I think, it goes to the gay rights hypocrisy trouble. And according to contemporaneous reporting at the time, Target's stock price took a huge hit when this became public, to the tune of over $1 billion in lost market capitalization. So why are the risk of boycotts potentially on the rise right now? One, I think there's this increasing partisanship among the American electorate, and the other is technology. So let me explain both of those in more depth. So I am sort of astonished and horrified by what Pew has been finding with the increasing polarization of the American electorate. This chart shows the difference over 20 years, and the two groups, the Republicans and the Democrats, are pulling farther and farther apart. To wit, according to Pew, 92% of Republicans are to the right of the median Democrat, and 94% of Democrats are to the left of the median Republican. And here, I think, is where it gets really unhealthy. Also, according to Pew, 27% of Democrats see the Republican Party as a threat to the nation's well-being. And not to be outdone, 36% of Republicans see the Democratic Party as a threat to the nation's well-being. It is as if we can no longer even stand one another. So, what is the risk if a corporation spends in politics today? One risk is that they will be boycotted. But one of the things to remember if we're talking about money in the First Amendment is that there is a long history of boycotts in America, and they are, as a general matter, legal. And the long history goes back to Hamilton. Hamilton is not just a hit show on Broadway. He was a real man, and he led a real boycott against slave-produced goods. And his fellow founding father, Ben Franklin, also encouraged Americans to do what is called a boycott. So a boycott is when you buy an alternative product to the one you were boycotting. And Benjamin Franklin was also concerned about the slave-produced sugarcane, and so he wanted people to instead enjoy good American maple syrup as the alternative. Boycotts were also instrumental, of course, in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And a little late to the game, the Supreme Court acknowledges in the 80s that it is protected First Amendment activity to hold a political boycott. That has not stopped the James Bobs of the world from arguing in many a campaign finance case that the fact that a corporation can be boycotted is the equivalent of harassment, and that should be a reason that campaign finance disclosure rules should be ruined. But for the most part, this has fallen on deaf ears among the judiciary, including Judge Englund, who had the Prop 8 case in front of him. And the Prop 8 case gave campaign finance reformers like myself serious heartburn. And the reason it gave me serious heartburn is there was real harassment in that case. People got death threats, their houses were egged, there was real problem, call the cops and arrest that person who's throwing eggs at your house. We're not going to use this as an excuse to get rid of transparency in money and politics. And one of the things that he writes in that case is disclosure prevents the wolf from masquerading in sheep's clothing, and that's why we need transparency in money and politics. And even the late Justice Scalia, in his concurrence in Doe v. Reed, says, harsh criticism short of unlawful action is a price our people have traditionally been willing to pay for self-governance. Requiring people to stand up in public for their political acts fosters civic courage, without which democracy is doomed. And consumer boycotts are not the only issue. There's also your investors. And you can think about political brands having two Achilles heels. One is their consumer base, and the other is their investor base. And there is a huge history of political divestment movements, including the one to try to end apartheid in South Africa. And even today, there is a divestment movement trying to get endowments, especially at universities, to divest from fossil fuels. So the final example that I will talk about today is the ALEC exodus, which has happened over the past couple of years, which shows the potential for both consumers and investors to have a huge impact. So ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's made up of state lawmakers and corporations. ALEC was the source of many different conservative laws that have been promulgated over the past couple of decades, including the Standard Ground Law and certain voter ID laws. And after the death of Trayvon Martin in my home state of Florida, consumer groups started putting pressure on consumer products to disassociate themselves from ALEC. And so in 2012, there was a wave of consumer product producers that did drop their ALEC associations. So Coke, Pepsi, Kraft, McDonald's, Wendy's, all in 2012 dropped their ALEC memberships. Then a few years later, the baton gets picked up by investors. Investors start asking their companies, why are you supporting this group? And there was a second wave of corporations dropping their ALEC memberships, and this time it was a wave of publicly traded corporations, especially in the technology field, where it was very easy to make a transparency argument to them. Why are you giving to this sketchy group? And so Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and Yahoo all dropped their membership in ALEC under pressure from their investors. So you might think of this as the 1-2 punch. Consumers show their displeasure, and investors show their displeasure, and 100 corporations have disassociated themselves from ALEC as a result. So for a corporate political spender, I think this is the word of warning. There was a polling done at the eve of the last presidential election which asked this question. Would you refuse to buy a company's products or services based on their political spending? Does anyone want to guess what the percentage is? Say I would actually boycott because of political spending? Give me a guess.
40%.
Wrong! I find this staggering that nearly 80% said that they would boycott because of corporate political spending. And furthermore, there's an app for that. So if you want to avoid every product made by the Koch brothers, which includes lots of paper products because they own Georgia Pacific, you can use smartphone applications like this, like Boycott, Bipartisan, or Second Vote, which will inform you as you are going through the local grocery store and scanning barcodes whether they are behind a particular product or not. And if you don't like what the smartphone app tells you, you can then choose not to buy that product. So I think there's a perfect storm for corporate political spenders right now. On the one hand, their brands are enormously valuable to them. We have an American public that's growing more partisan. We have smartphone apps that empower end users to avoid products on a partisan basis. And so boycotts, boycotts, and divestment are already happening. And not relevant to today, there was an article just a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times talking about corporations being very reluctant to fund the Republican National Convention in Cleveland. And one of the lines in that New York Times article was from an activist from Color of Change who said, "Do we really want riots that were brought to you by Coca-Cola?" And that I will end. Thank you.
Jennifer Wallach, and I'll be commenting on the papers. And because the papers are pretty awesome, I'm not going to really criticize them so much as talk about ways to extend profitable lines of inquiry further. And I start with the Rita, Franz, and Fowler paper. My favorite bits to start. I thought this was kind of a nice point to say that the candidates were the most likely to be talking about the same issues among all the kind of set of possible actors, and that's kind of really a good point for deliberation to pull out to say that at least the candidates probably are talking to each other to some extent, which should be certainly normatively appealing for things of deliberation. I also thought that the low congruence that was found between the parties and the groups and the candidates on the issues were probably could explain some public opinion problems as well. Like, it's terrifying to look at how bad citizens are at answering issue questions in campaigns. I think most voters can't name any issue associated with the presidential candidate. And well, this might explain it in part. Like, certainly if everyone's talking past each other and there's not a lot of agreement on the same campaign agenda, that explains some of the difficulties citizens have in making sense of things. Things I wondered about, these are kind of things I think would be fun data things to pull out to extend the reach of the paper. I think these are quantities that could be interesting to a lot of scholars. And I wondered about the degree to which groups are bringing something more nationalized to campaign agendas across the country. For the most part, campaigns have been fairly regional. There's been rising interest that the increasing party presence in campaigns has nationalized campaigns. And certainly I think groups have the potential to do that as well around issue agendas, and that's probably even a bigger concern than the kind of nationalization that might come around party influence. So you have some really unique data that could tell us something about the degree to which there's homogenous issue agendas that are happening across groups of states. And that would be really in contrast to a lot of the interest group literature as well. So you also do a lot of work in interest groups, and I think the state interest group populations, and there's still a surprising degree of really localism about interest groups, and so this might be a real counter pressure that forces other changes in how group influence happens across the states. I was also interested to know whether incumbents were different than challengers. Like, was there a different issue focus when you have the incumbents who have a real history of votes and policy positions and promises made to the electorate? And certainly that's probably pretty easy data to pull out, but I think would be really interesting to a lot of people, and easily pulled into people who study congressional elections directly, kind of Congress scholar types of people. I wondered if there was an upper limit to campaign ad buys, and I guess maybe that was just normative of me to hope that maybe there's some sort of carrying capacity argument, because I was thinking to the population ecology arguments of Ray and Lowry to some extent that if the room gets crowded enough, the dynamics of voice start changing a little bit, and we're actually maybe pushing up against that, at least some of these states and some of these races. And the degree to which you're seeing differences maybe across different electoral contexts based on the volume would be a really provocative finding that I think would really radically change how we think about campaign spending. Because so far we've seen it as really exponential growth. Maybe it's not. Like, maybe there is some point where it starts to level off because there's just not an opportunity to get voice, especially when they're all disagreeing with each other, right? If there's not convergence, then these voices might just be noise rather than message sending, and that might limit the power of groups to continue to add messages to that environment. I think this is probably a next step for the research, and that's to try to explain what explains issue focuses and issue convergence across these different campaigns. I wondered, when looking at some of the tables, whether this wasn't directional theory, the degree to which Democrats and Republicans weren't agreeing on a lot of this, whether that was strategic position taking in line with a lot of issue voting theories about they're staking out issues where they know they have majority electoral support. You could also easily make a nice, beautiful table tracking against Egan's issue ownership measures to see how much that's tracking in modern campaigns, and pull it against most important problem questions out of surveys to see to what degree this is mapping onto public preferences as well. On the normative grounds, I was trying to figure out whether I should feel sad about this paper or happy, and you kind of got to that in your talk too, and I couldn't decide. Because generally speaking, I love ad spending. I always like to scare my undergraduates by talking about how much I love the idea of spending a bunch of money in campaigns, because if they just paid attention, we wouldn't need these things. Voters are stupid, so we need a lot of ads to educate them about how the hell to choose. So I generally think ad buys are a positive thing, but these ad buys are negative, and the value of those is more contested for sure. But they're not doing anything necessarily harmful. They're not necessarily derailing the campaign agendas as far as your data is suggesting so far. But they are talking about different things that aren't necessarily the things voters care about. The most important problem questions from this time period are jobs and education and taxes. And those are the issues the candidates are talking about, but not the issues that groups are talking about. And I think that certainly this is something you engage in the paper. I'd love to see more about it. But one of my biases, probably you might suspect them, is I'd love to see how this matters for voters and pull that into CCS data or ANES data to try to demonstrate some of these consequences for voters, because I think that would really help you sort some of these normative arguments in a really powerful way. Do the issue and agendas of groups shape most important problem answers for voters? Certainly that would be a very powerful fact to find that would shape how we think about these groups. Do group ads have the same educative effects as campaign ads do, party ads do? Do we learn from them just the same way? Because then they're serving a normative good. And, are the states where you're finding greater issue convergence, are those places that have more informed and more educated sorts of citizens? Because that's also informative to say, okay, to what degree should we be feeling good or bad about the growth of interest groups buying ads in states? So, turning to Chara's paper, very fun to read. I loved the presentation, lots of cool examples. Some of them I'd seen before and some of them I hadn't. I didn't realize that they had done MRIs with people to see what kind, because I don't think those match up, because I always thought that Donuts was Democratic brand. But they were lighting up Republican screens, so I had to research that further and get some donuts and see how happy it makes me. So I like that this narrative, I think, is pointing out something really useful about why companies might not want to be overtly political. Does anyone know this list of companies and what they have in common? So, Serta, Univision, NBC Universal, Farouk Systems, Macy's, Perfumania. Trump. They're all people who've broken off relationships with Trump as soon as he started becoming political. And so that's kind of a very salient debate right now, and I kept waiting in the paper for a Trump reference, because I thought that it was a really good application of the narrative you're telling, that certainly companies are making very explicit choices to break off ties with Trump as he's becoming more political, or political in ways that they don't necessarily like. It also explains the reverse problem, or the reverse issue. It's not a problem necessarily, but one thing we've often observed is that politicians are often very wary about saying things about companies, favorite sports teams, favorite anything. I'm just using terrible examples on the top of my head. One of my favorite magazines I read every week is Us Weekly, and it's a wonderful magazine, and the political coverage is fantastic. I love the political coverage in Us Weekly, and so this past week I was reading 25 Things You Didn't Know About Ted Cruz. And it was very interesting how he chooses to talk about himself, right? Like his references to his children. It's not about really what he does for hobbies or anything, except for he is on level 350 Candy Crush, which is, I think a safe choice of a brand to endorse. But generally speaking, I think it's hard to find examples of politicians and their brand likes. Like, do we know what kind of coffee Obama drinks? Do we know what his favorite soda is? No. Maybe someone does, I don't. And it explains the classic problem of politics, and that's why politicians never advertise on NASCARs, right? Car covered in ad space. You could easily put on your presidential logo there, your candidate logo, and it might be because you fear that the car is going to get crashed and it's going to look bad for your team, but more likely is that those are really deep identities for NASCAR fans. Like, you are a Chevy person, you're a Ford person, you're an Earnhardt person, or something else, and you don't want to break up those cross-cutting allegiances. those are our strong identities to people as well. So that explains also why politicians don't go the opposite way. I think you raised two different mechanisms about where citizen negativity is rooted when it comes to corporate donations. One is a kind of partisan argument to say, we don't like it when companies give money to groups we don't like, so that makes us sad inside that they're not supporting the interests we care about. We also raise this idea that you just think, some people think that corporations shouldn't donate money at all because it's wrong. And that's a much more legitimacy-based narrative. And the more you kind of sort that out, would be really useful to the arguments you're trying to make, because they have very different implications for democracy. Is this about angry partisans who just want to be on the winning team and see their partisans supporting the things they like? Or is this about a mistrustful electorate that's really sad and disappointed and mistrustful when they see money in politics? Your story emphasizes how companies might be punished for embracing different political agendas. And I think that there are also the potential to have rewards for having a politicized brand. So I pulled my own survey data. It's Rasmussen reports, which isn't its mediocre survey data as things go, but it's interesting. And in the wake of all the cafes donations to anti-gay marriage groups, 13% of Americans said that they would boycott Chick-fil-A. But then 31% of Americans said that they're going to eat there more to show their support for the brand. And I think that's possible too. Like, if you read the political science literature that exists on political consumerism, a lot of that's emphasizing really the positive sides of things, about how people will go out of their way to seek out environmentally conscious brands or seek out fair trade products. And so I wondered the extent to which some companies might be able to win support by making popular political affiliations. And we see that to some extent, right? Like, JCPenney is making clear choices to demonstrate strong diversity, including gay couples in their advertising, and that's a very political stand, but they think it's one that will secure them popular support. I also wondered about the degree to which this is a widespread phenomenon, and I have a lot of reasons why I'm a little bit skeptical about the degree to which this is widespread. For one, voters aren't necessarily very well informed about this. They don't know. 80% of Americans know their governor, 95% know the president, which means 5% don't know who the president is, which is terrifying. And so if you start moving down lists on these things, like, I would think that a lot of people wouldn't know the political affiliations of a lot of different brands, and that would make it really hard for them to act on it in practice. Certainly there's an app there, but I'm never going to use it. I don't think a lot of people would use it. You might download it for fun, try it out in the store once, but I don't think most people are really going to do that in a systematic way for the most part. At least past maybe one or two brands that have stood out to someone. I'm not as convinced by your survey data. The 79% is impressive, but I went and looked at the survey because it was really an outlier among all the surveys I had looked at, because I think that one, the whole survey is really anti-campaign finance, and so I'm worried it was tipping people. So, like, Pew data from 2010 puts it closer to like 28%, and that was consistent with other surveys I was seeing too, that maybe a third of the left voters are saying this is something they're doing. In terms of the divestment, I think very few people are actually stock owners. Half of Americans own stock, but most of them own it through funds in retirement, and they don't actually know what they're buying there. I'm actually a YouGov participant. I recently signed up to do YouGov surveys for fun, and so I'm actually a contributor to the brand index scoring, which you mentioned in the paper. And so recently I was asked to evaluate 30 different hotel brands, and I found it difficult to make sense of any of them, because I'm like, I don't actually have opinions about most hotels, like Hyatt versus Hilton. I don't know. So I think that's a tricky problem here, is that when you start thinking about how many products there are, most of these donors aren't producing consumer goods directly. They're not identifiable brands to consumers. And so I wonder if this argument only holds for a slice of really the most prominent consumer brands that are really known to people. So I think what this sets up is an idea that maybe companies can get away with being political, that voters don't have enough information to follow this, and don't necessarily have enough information to punish it. And certainly we don't know anything about what politicians, where they get their money from. I think if you ask the average voter on the street, who's donating to Hillary these days, they would guess and probably not be correct. So if we don't know what politicians are getting their money from, then it's reasonable to expect we also don't know where our companies are donating to. And so that suggests that you can make some strong normative arguments about what should we do in the face of that. Perhaps, I believe your mechanism is totally true. I believe that it's possible for people to become informed enough to actually punish companies for their political stance. So maybe the suggestion then is to increase the publicity around corporate affiliations to politics. And because I want to bookend with NASCAR references, one more. We could have politicians dressed like NASCAR drivers, and then we'd know exactly what they do. So.
So actually, before we take questions from the floor, Jenny asked a lot of questions, and so why don't you just pick one or two to respond to? So, yeah,
You first. Yeah, I have a quick one, which is I've been struggling with how to test, or at least empirically test, the effects of different rates of issue convergence on voters. I'm sure there are good ways to do it. I think a lot more about it. But one way I did it in a previous paper, which is not satisfactory, but it was fun for exploratory purposes, was to estimate issue convergence rates between a candidate, say a Democrat candidate, and the full set of pro candidates, so their full set of allies on the interest group side, so not group specific, but sort of the entire set of ads here in that race, and to get an estimate of an issue convergence score, sort of all groups with the candidate on either side, and then use that to sort of look at the relationship between those convergence rates controlling for ad totals and other things on vote totals. Right? It's not good, it's not ideal, but do we get a sense that higher convergence rates, although not exogenous to outcomes, would in fact be correlated with higher vote totals? And that came up null. And so one argument we draw from that would be that issue convergence rates don't have any effect on the persuasiveness of ad buys, but I don't know how to think that yet. So, I want to think some more about how you test it, whether it's through survey data or whether it's through aggregate data or whether it's through an experimental setup where you vary issue messages that voters see, but vary the issue focused messages. So reinforcing a stream of messages on one side and then a divergent set of messages and see how voters respond to that stuff. So there's a lot to be done in that side of things, and I think it's really important to know what this all generally means, which is why my good news, bad news is pretty speculative. So thank you for your time.
So I've been working on this paper off and on for 3 years, which is very rare for me. Like, usually I do I can bang out a law review really, really quickly. But this has been a rabbit hole of a topic. And one of the things that I started with was the Dan Cathy type. He's the CEO of Chick-fil-A. So, and he triggers both a boycott and a boycott. So he says things like, I only want traditional marriages or traditional families at my restaurants or something along those lines. The coded anti-gay way of speaking. And so you have supporters of gay rights who boycott Chick-fil-A, as you say, and you had church groups declaring Chick-fil-A Day, and they would en masse show up to buy the chicken sandwiches. And when I started looking at the CEO statements, one of my research assistants came back to me and said, do you want me to cover all of the Donald Trump statements? And this was before he was a political candidate. And his statements were so crazy that I had to drop him out of basically my data set. Because it seemed like no matter what he said before he became a political candidate, it never seemed to hurt the Trump brand. The Apprentice seemed to continue to get good ratings. It seemed like nothing he could say could have an impact, which may explain some of his behavior in his actual political campaign, because he's not used to having one of his outrageous statements maybe be fact-checked, be focused on, and actually have a negative impact, like Macy's dropping his shirt brand. And maybe that will be a different paper. But yeah, has been when you do with a problem like Donald Trump has been a perpetual theme of this particular
Affects
project.
all of us, actually.
Yes, but yeah, he is a unique individual. They leave it at that.
Ryan, and then Corey, and then Rick.
Yeah, I have a question for Michael about, I guess I'm just a little bit confused about how we can make the causal inference you're suggesting about the effect that independent group spending is having on the sort of substance or shape of the agenda. Because just by looking at this kind of data, because candidates know that there are independent groups and they would behave differently if there weren't independent groups, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, an important part of the reason that independent groups are more negative than candidates is that candidates know that they have independent groups who they are basically working with, even if they're not explicitly coordinating with, or even if they are. And so they can leave that activity to the super PACs. So there's not convergence between the two of them, but if there were no super PACs, then candidates would probably be a lot more negative. And likewise, so that's a case where the level of convergence sort of exaggerates the difference that outside groups are bringing to the agenda. But there are cases that work the opposite way too. So if a super PAC is very effective at bringing some topic that isn't being talked about onto the agenda, then the candidates are going to have to start talking about it. And then there's going to be convergence between the candidates and outside groups. But the measure is going to suggest that outside groups aren't having an impact, but they are having an important impact.
Yeah, one of the things that we've done in some previous work on this from previous cycles has been to tease some of that out because, there's one paper we have that uses this in the title, and my co-authors tried for years for me to ditch it, but I like the phraseology, which is the question of whether or not interest group spending represents, or interest groups are better portrayed as loose cannons or loyal foot soldiers. And sort of a loose cannon philosophy would be sort of they inject all these new issues into the debate and hijack the agenda. The loyal foot soldier would be they match the candidates' agendas and therefore reinforce candidates. But that presumes any number of empirical outcomes, whether low or high convergence, could be evidence of a loyal foot soldier or a loose cannon model, depending on whether groups are creating a division of labor with candidates and so forth, right? So what we tried to do in some previous work is look at the temporal, so the change over the course of an election cycle. Who's causing issue overlap? Is it the groups or is it the candidates? And it's really, really tough to do that empirically. But what we've been able to do, and what we feel sort of comfortable with, and what the evidence seems to suggest, is that it's, well, first of all, as I suggested to you earlier, one of the answers to all questions is it depends. And that's true. It does depend. Both things seem to happen. But it does seem more true that what we call multi-group, multi-issue sort of groups, like these traditional these new type super PACs, big organizations that don't have single issues as the theme, in the data that we've been able to look at in terms of what's causing what, tend to be much, much more likely to adopt the issue agendas that the candidates lay out first than the single issue groups do. So a candidate is likely to sort of raise a set of issues, and the groups that are then most likely to also talk about those issues subsequent to that are these big super PACs.
But maybe the candidates only pick those issues because they're already influenced in the in the previous round by the super PACs.
Possibly.
I think the temporal thing is just
right.
as dicey.
It is, yeah, and so then you're left with really very little that you can do to answer that sort of big sort of question. So one way to do this is sort of narrow the question and just sort of say how much additional issues are on the agenda as a result of these groups, and limit the sort of counterfactuals.
Thanks. I'm sorry for moving around sciatica. I have a question for Michael, actually. Did you look, or can you speculate about effectiveness, the way this dynamic relates to effectiveness of the PAC? So I would think that the single issue PACs, that they just don't work as much because they're not coordinating with the candidate. I mean, what you really get in those instances where there's coordination is they're following the rules, but
possible. I mean, certainly candidates say that. Certainly candidates would prefer to have control over those resources than not. But there's also evidence, experimental evidence, to suggest that outside group spending can be more effective than candidate spending for lots of different mechanisms besides the issue convergence rates. Namely, a tax can shield a candidate from a backlash. Voters tend to distrust candidate motivations but don't know anything about these sort of super PACs and therefore might see them as more credible. And that's just sort of, in that setting, voters see information and they try to figure out which information to accept or reject. And outside groups might be more effective in that way. But then when you intersect with that, or then ask whether or not the issues that they raise also amplify or weaken that effect, it's an open question at this point. Certainly candidates would prefer to control the resources they can, so to the extent that they can, it might introduce it might mean that those ads don't have as much effects.
Chiara, do you think, I was wondering what I don't know, I guess from listening to you, my thought was, how are, over time, these brands going to keep involving themselves in politics? I mean, it just seems like you're, by definition, going to lose market share, moving yourself politically. I mean, I guess my reaction is that maybe the effect of that is going to be less and less spending over time. What do you think of that? Because why, you got your politics you care about, but now you start seeing that you're losing market share. Why do it?
Yeah. So when Color of Change threatened a boycott against Coca-Cola for its membership in ALEC, Coca-Cola dropped its membership in ALEC within 24 hours.
Yes.
Like, it was instantaneous. They didn't even have to go to an actual boycott. The threat of the boycott was enough. And I just have no powers of prognostication to say that other companies will learn from that experience. Like, don't get involved in politics or don't get involved in ALEC. ALEC is still very well funded and still exists. So even though 100 companies have disassociated, it doesn't mean that the other corporations are still happy to pick up the slack and pay for the ALEC memberships.
And they're willing to forego profits for their ideological,
I have a question about negative campaigning by outside groups and the relationship between that and people who don't vote or who vote only the top of the ticket and then drop the rest of it, and don't vote for most of the candidates. So, the questions are, of course, is that an effect? In other words, is negative campaigning actually depress the vote? And is more controversial, I suppose, is that a purpose of some of that negative campaign?
Good questions. It may be a purpose of some for certain segments of the electorate. I think the research is pretty suggestive that negative campaigning. I don't know about sort of roll off in the sense of people just not voting in certain races even if they turn out to vote. But in terms of turnout rates, it doesn't seem to be the case that negative ads depress turnout rates. It can, some people have suggested, impact turnout rates depending on when you've made your decision what you're going to vote for. And if you've settled on someone and then see a series of negative ads, that you might sort of doubt your decision and then decide to abstain. But by and large, if you just look at instances of rates of negativity and turnout rates, they don't appear to be related empirically very well, despite early work that suggests that it would. So then you start to wonder about, with all of the growth in micro-targeting efforts of candidates these days and finding segments of the electorate, it's possible that some of the efforts of those candidates and groups, whether it's through online or through local cable buys, might be about boosting or perhaps suppressing segments. I think that remains an open question. It's an important one.
Connor?
Yes, thanks. I guess for Mike, kind of building off the first question we had there, I'm just also curious if you could say a little bit more, not necessarily based on the evidence here, but all the work you've done, the extent to which this is just purposeful, right? And is this just the direction we're headed in, where these bifurcated campaigns where the groups take care of this and the candidates take care of this side of it, and is there any evidence that we're heading towards less convergence in some sense?
Yeah.
Both in terms of negative and positive, that's also just in terms of issues. And then for Chara, I guess it's more of a surveys, or the first wave of the survey, they try to get a lot of their brand preferences. So for one example, I think they've done like fast food chains. Like, do you prefer, do you frequent, Burger King, McDonald's, or Wendy's? And then the second wave of the survey, they tell them something about who these groups the types of groups they tend to donate to. And at the end of that survey, they ask them whether they want, their reward is going to be something like a $5 gift card, or something that's related to going to this. And they do find some effects of even people who like frequent McDonald's or frequent Wendy's, when they find out who they're donating to, if that doesn't agree with their predispositions, they're less likely to take that $5 gift certificate than someone that was in the control group that didn't get that information. And so, I don't think everybody does it, and it's not like, I don't think it's like, everyone who finds out this information decides, I don't want this gift card, right? There's plenty of people that, and some of it I think comes down to they kind of map people to how much other options they have, which is kind of neat, right? Like, well, if Wendy's is just really far from my house, I might still go to Burger King even though I don't know even though I don't like who they contribute to. If I just really need a fast food burger on the way home, which sometimes I do. But I think that's perfectly consistent with a lot of what you're saying is that but it goes back to this question that Jenny brought up of people have to have that information, right? And so your broader argument about we need more transparency is, well, how do we go about doing that? On one hand, right, they can force feed them this information in a survey, but that doesn't mean they get it otherwise, and it doesn't mean they remember it 4 weeks down the road when they're driving down the road and they say, oh, where do I want to stop, right? Political scientists were inherently skeptical that people remember anything at this point, really. I guess.
Sure. So it's a really fascinating question about sort of the purposeful nature of convergence rates or whether or not we see any trends. When Travis Ritter has a paper back, I think in 2006, he has a few others, about convergence between candidates in Senate races in like 98, 2000, 2002. They found convergence rates between candidates that are higher than the 0.29 that we find in this paper. And I've been trying to figure out, because when we've done it in, say, 2012, 2010, looking at Senate races and convergence rates between candidates, we find lower rates than what they found in those earlier cycles. I'm trying to figure out if that's an artifact of coding, or whether it's a real trend. Might be an artifact of the coding in part because early coders in the Wisconsin advertising project were limited to the number of issues they could select. And in more recent cycles, we've essentially freed coders to just click on as many issues as we mentioned. So that's one possible thing. But even if you look at 2014 versus 2012 or 2010, the candidate convergence rates are slightly lower than what they were there. So it might be suggestive of a trend, in which case one might then attribute that to this purposeful division of labor that might be going on, in part, between allied groups and the candidates. And we know that many super PACs are, in fact, functional allies. I mean, functionally, they're not allowed to coordinate, but they're run by their former chief of staff, their friend, college roommate, or dad, or something like that. And so, why wouldn't they be, in a sense, dividing up the labor over which issues to, off the books? And that's possible, and remains to be seen, how that works in this cycle and moving forward. But it's also really hard to attribute that trend line to anything in particular, and it's really hard to tease out any empirical sort of purposeful division later. Some of that is to sort of change over the course of the election cycle and try to figure that out, but really run into these challenges that way. But I think it's an important question and one that, ultimately, from the perspective of the candidate, you prefer, like I mentioned, to not rely. There was a paper someone wrote a few years ago talking about the effect of interest group ads on voters and talked about how it was, those ads can be more effective. And then there was a line in there that said something like, so candidates therefore hope that they receive this support in competitive elections because it will amplify their votes. But, I'm not comfortable with candidates deciding that their strategies are based on what they hope to happen. They would really like to be in control of that. And so even a division of labor is a very risky strategy, even if your buddy is running a super PAC. One, because you might get caught coordinating it. Two, because they just might decide in the strategy session that whatever you want to do is actually not ideal, right? And so, so the purposeful nature of convergence rates, I'm doubtful that that's a major reason why it's low.
I'd love to
citation to that so that I can add it to my paper. I mean, one of the things that strikes me in looking at there's an app for that aspect of this, is this may be very generational. Like, I will not use these 3 apps. Like, I just won't. It's not my nature. But some of the interviews, and there've been, MTV has done pieces on these apps and how to use them. And one of the reviews from a younger user said, I love this. This gamifies shopping. The idea of gamifying shopping is like anathema to me. But I think to a certain, think of the young kids voting for Sanders. Like, the thought that they can figure out, oh, this is a Koch brother product, I don't want to buy that. And that makes them feel empowered and politically engaged and savvy. And I know something about this that you don't know. I wonder whether there may be some there. Buycott has 1 million users, and they're not all in the US. People use Buycott actually all over the world to boycott and boycott products that they find objectionable. The other 2 apps only have about 100,000, as far as I can tell, of users. So that has not reached the tipping point, or like everyone's walking through the the shopping mall checking out partisanship. But I think if you combined a hashtag war with some of these applications, you could, if Color for Change really wants to pick a fight over who funded the convention this summer, I think they could have an impact.
Tabitha?
So I think I have similar questions to what Jennifer was raising, but I come at it from a very different angle. So I have to say, when you set up your first slide, I thought your thesis was going to be the opposite, because if consumer products, and that's part of my second point is about the consumer versus not, are so caught up geographically and in your identity, then I think it seems less likely to me that there are as many political costs to engaging. Yeah, and the one thing, so one thing I was thinking about the Chick-fil-A, right? Mm-hmm. So, or Domino's. I might say, yeah, I'm going to boycott those. But I live in not only a Democratic district, I live in a district where the only signs out are for Murray. There is no Chick-fil-A for me to boycott. I've never eaten at Chick-fil-A. Yeah. So there's no Domino's.
Yeah,
right?
So
no
I can say,
boycott, I would boycott them, but I have no opportunity to.
Yeah.
And I think that gets to the point, actually, about the question of market share, which is, it's not like these consumer products are sort of equally distributed anyways. So they've already, in some ways, figured out that they are profitable without trying to sell their products to law professors in highly unrepresented Democratic districts, right? So I have to say, I went to a talk at Wharton School where they said, corporations are rational actors, they're not going to do this. And the example came up right around when Target got into trouble in Minnesota. But your data, actually, where you started, made me think maybe this is highly naive. And the second thing I was thinking about, which I think was also the direction Jennifer was bringing up, was what products do we identify with our identity? What products are politicized, and what products are sort of part of our identity, and what issues are part of our identity and what aren't. Because, so if I compare what you have up to, Rick Haslam's slide, Chevron, what I noticed about the highest spenders in election is they start with Chevron. That was the only company I actually recognized the name of. The rest of them were all energy companies. I'm not really sure that when you go to buy gas, you're thinking about, well, I'm a Democrat, so I'm going to buy this kind of gas. And I'm not really sure it would be at all reasonable to decide that BP was actually worse on environmental issues than whatever else. So I guess I think, or the tax code, which is what I've been really thinking about, most of the lobbying is about tax Koch brothers example, on the one hand, makes you happy, right? Okay, so now you can figure out. I don't know what Coke produces. Now maybe I can go out and figure out what they produce. But they're also unrepresentative in the sense that they've become a flashpoint for the Democratic Party, even if they're only symbolic of a problem that's not really getting at the issue. So I guess what I'm trying to make is 2 points. One is I think there's this issue about the geographic segregation of products, the way that some products are politicized, or at least part of identity, even if it's not actually partisan. And then how that's different from other issues. And I guess I would be really curious if you went through those boycotts and boycotts, how many of them are about cultural issues, and ones that have more salience, and how many of them are really about consumer products.
Okay, so in the short time we have, we should talk over lunch. Second vote is different than the other two because second vote is self-consciously aimed at conservative consumers. And so what second vote does is they are waging the culture war. They are judging corporations on their stance on abortion and their stance on gun rights primarily. Now, of course, anyone can download this app. And so if you're actually worried about corporations supporting gun rights, this is the perfect app to tell you that. And it'll probably tell you that in more detail than like almost any other source. But there are these articles, like I found an article by Ginny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's very conservative wife, saying that all conservative consumers should download this app and they should use it against corporations. So yeah, I think the cultural war, cultural identity thing is a live issue, and whether that maps clearly to the partisan issue, I think it's going to depend on which of the topics you pick.
Roger.
Yeah, I just had a general question for Chara. I'm curious what you would think or how you would take account of the backlash against North Carolina's recent anti-transgender laws, where we see, I'm not sure if any of it have been enacted, but we've seen these threats from some corporations they're going to stop operating in the state. Which seems like a weird twist. Now it's the corporations boycotting not the states, but the consumers, the citizens in the state. Any thoughts on how that would fit in?
Yeah. And what I also sort of wonder is those corporations who have made those stances vis-a-vis Mississippi and North Carolina and all of these states who are passing these horrifying homophobic laws, whether in other parts of the country that they will pay a price for having taken the pro-gay stance. So Target gets targeted for taking the anti-gay stance. And I wonder whether they will also get backlash from certain consumers because they have pulled out of North Carolina, for example. And that will be, for all of you empiricists here, an empirical question, which I'd love to know